Wednesday, January 27th, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Debra Mason and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, the power of political polling. We'll look at how both the media and the candidates' campaigns use it to both gauge and influence public opinion. Bloomberg covering Bloomberg. The former New York mayor has long since made it taboo for his media company to report on his wealth or business holdings. So what happens if he does end up making a run at the White House? And will a judge buy it? A man convicted of threatening a California Islamic advocacy group claims binge-watching Fox News made him do it. There's a whole lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well. But first,
of heated anger that day on November 9th. And I doubt very much that she would do anything like that again. I just don't think the person is dangerous.
MU Assistant Professor Melissa Click will keep her job for now, despite newly filed charges against her.
Melissa Click pleaded not guilty in yesterday's court proceedings. The city prosecutor has spent the better part of 2 months considering the charges, the result of a confrontation caught on tape by citizen journalist Mark Schierbecker on the Carnahan Quad back on November 9th. You've probably seen it many times. At the beginning of the video, you see a confrontation between journalism student Tim Tye on assignment that day for ESPN and MU staff member Jana Bassler. At the end of the video, the confrontation between Schierbecker and Click, ending with Click calling for some muscle over here. Ernest, going back to our first discussion on this topic, going all the way back to November, one of the biggest themes about this was how the media ended up becoming the story in this case. And here we are 2 months later, Tim Tye, Mark Schierbecker, Janet Bassler, Melissa Click, all household names because of this viral video. How much do we think those charges might be the result of pressure from articles in the Tribune the past couple weeks, wondering will the charges come or won't they before the city prosecutor's retirement?
I think that had a lot to do with it. I think it was a pressure by state legislators. I think it was pressure from the stories upon stories that we've seen in the media. I think a lot of this could have been avoided had the citizen journalist reporter, Mark Schierbecker, not filed the complaint with MUPD. Then if you don't have the complaint, you don't have the investigation, you don't have the city prosecutor getting involved. I'm not saying that you wouldn't have everything that's going on with the legislators, because they seem to need someone to blame for what happened on campus, and Melissa Click is the person that they can sort of wrap their collective hate around. And sort of go after her. So I think you still would have had that aspect of it, but I think the charges in and of themselves come from this pressure that you see from all of those involved.
Yeah, Debra, your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't want to make a judgment based on legalities.
Okay.
I mean, I think the prosecutor was probably acting in good faith in terms of based on evidence and so forth, and that's for the legal profession to look at. I guess what troubles me is that we're once again talking about a white woman. We're not talking about the issues that led to this incident in terms of concerned student 1950. We're not talking about the tensions, the racial tensions, and potential solutions, and who is going to lead our university, the University of Missouri, going forward. So I feel as though the story has become, at this point, a distraction, frankly, and it's something quick to latch onto. It's sensationalistic. But at the same time, I think the legal case will proceed forward, and let's focus really on the most important part of this story, which is how do we deal with these racial tensions and how do we bring some peace and collaboration among our students.
Well, I would agree that is a story. That should have been a story all along. I think part of the issue for the media becomes whenever they try to focus on that as an issue, then you have legislators and others that sort of go back to this, well, what about this First Amendment right of this citizen journalist and of Tim Tye, who was working on behalf of ESPN, and what about the lack of leadership in terms of dealing with that? You have this faculty member who they would say should have been in class or doing other things and not out on Carnahan Quadrangle along with Janet Bassler. So you've got all of that going on. So the media is trying to cover this issue in what some of them would say in a more holistic way, but the narrative keeps getting driven in that direction, and it's difficult for media to come back to here's what the story should be. I'm not justifying what the media is doing because I agree with you. I think this is what they should be doing. But when you start asking those questions of officials, they tend to want to go back to that narrative.
Well, because it takes them off the hook. And that's, I think, also where the media is not really doing its job by going deeper into what is the real motivation on the part of the legislators in terms of making these complaints. Is it really one individual? I don't think so.
Well, that's the key to me.
Yeah.
That's the part of the story that's not getting enough attention,
right.
Is what is the motivation on the part of the legislators. That came out during some Senate hearings yesterday. I think it was the committee that Kurt Schaefer is in charge of, which is the Senate Appropriations. At the end, he felt the need to want to respond to what was going on in the Melissa Click case. And then you began to have this sort of piling on by other legislators. And then you had Democratic legislators who pretty much jumped in and said, whoa, wait a minute, you all are grandstanding. What about the fact that you kicked the press off the Senate floor, and that's a First Amendment issue. So you're talking about Melissa Click violating First Amendment issues, but now here you are violating First Amendment issues. So now you've got this sort of back and forth going on, and it doesn't get to what you were talking about, which is what's really going on the MU campus in relation to what the concerned students of 1950 and others were talking about back in November.
There was another media angle to this as well that came out this week. And as we sit here and we have this conversation on KBIA, and people are able to also hear it, watch it, listen to it on KBIA.org, we should note KBIA posted something on its website the other day that KBIA had been approached to host a program, basically, where Mark Schierbecker and Melissa Click had both been invited, sort of. KBIA was kind of asked to serve as the journalistic outlet, if you will. And KBIA first listened to the request and the offer, and as time went on, withdrew any willingness to consider that as it became apparent that whether or not KBIA participated and if this happened, it might result in charges being filed or not. An interesting choice on the part of KBIA's newsroom to make that information public and put that out there.
Yeah, I was a little baffled at why KBIA decided to put that out there and be transparent, because those kinds of negotiations between sources and news organizations go on all the time, and nothing becomes of it because it doesn't appear to be a story or anything that might be newsworthy. And in going back through this, I'm getting that same sort of sense because you really didn't have the kind of cooperation that you needed from both parties, and there seemed to be sort of a willingness on the part of Schierbecker to sort of get this thing going for his own personal gain, as opposed to there being some sort of newsworthy information coming out of this conversation between him and Click, if that was ever going to take place.
I think there were a lot of red flags that should have been raised when the citizen journalist came in with a publicist, a PR person. I mean, this is a 22-year-old student coming with his own publicist. I think there's been a lot of playing one media entity against another, and there's this lure of a scoop that can be really dangerous to journalists if they follow that without checking all of those red flags. And fortunately, I think the good news is that KBIA did feel that this didn't stand up to the level of ethics that it needed to.
Well, and interestingly enough, there was within the KBIA post a link to a CNN Money, which is where CNN houses its media coverage, a story posted on CNN Money that basically had the headline of how Melissa Click can avoid charges, and laying out that if she does this interview, and apologizes on the air. She won't be charged. Well, let's go ahead and move on to another topic. Tomorrow night, the Republican candidates for president will gather for one last debate before Monday's Iowa caucuses. But Donald Trump says he's not going if Megyn Kelly is moderating. Instead, he's going to hold a televised fundraiser to benefit wounded warriors. Just when we thought the silly period of this whole election cycle was over and we were really going to be getting down to business, Donald Trump pulls us.
I think we've got a long ways to go before the silly period is over.
Okay. Well, then we'll just keep the silly going then.
I can't get inside Donald Trump's head, but I think, maybe there is some inkling that he won't do as well as has been trumpeted in the polls. And so maybe this gives him some kind of a strategy to blame somebody for that participation, for those showings. I think it'll be easier to analyze after the Iowa caucus, and but I think that those debates are going to be just as silly, to be honest.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think he was looking for an out. I think Donald Trump was looking for an out because where he's sitting right now is really good, and the debate could hurt him more than help him. And the fact that the interesting fact about this is that he's going at it with Fox News, who has been 24/7 Donald Trump and Ted Cruz for like the last 4 or 5 months, if not longer. And so for him to sort of bite the hand that feeds him is sort of interesting. But even in doing that, you still see the stories out there. Just when you think it couldn't get any crazier, it gets crazier because he's biting the hand that's sort of feeding him.
So let me kind of throw another layer to this. At the same time this is all happening and Donald Trump says he's going to have his own televised event, it's going to be a fundraiser for wounded warriors, which on the face of it sounds like a really good populist move, right? Well, CBS has this story and this expose, if you will, that comes out late yesterday, early today, that basically looks at the finances of wounded warriors and shows that it really is only spending 60 cents on the dollar on veteran programs and supporting wounded warriors. So at the same time, Donald Trump is pulling this really populist move to support veterans. He's doing it alongside a rather beleaguered organization.
Yeah, I mean, this is the CBS report. I sort of caught glimpses of it. This is something that people have been talking about for a while, involving not just Wounded Warriors, but several other veteran organizations or organizations that claim to be helping veterans, and the fact that most of that money is going to administration as opposed to actually helping them. So it's going to be interesting to see how he portrays that if he actually follows through on doing this benefit. I'm still not sure whether or not he's actually going to do that.
So you still think there's a chance that Roger Ailes and Fox could roll over on this and somehow make some accommodation to get him on that podium tomorrow night?
I think they could, or Trump could do something else. But, like I said, he's sitting pretty right now. So, as they say, he's playing with house money. So he's doing pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, so it also seems that every day as we get deeper into this election cycle, there are new numbers that are out there, numbers that make it, frankly, clear as mud as to who's gaining ground, who's losing ground. Well, there was a great piece on the op-ed page of the New York Times on Sunday about our obsession with political polls. Its basic premise: there seems to be an inverse relationship between the preponderance of polling and the reliability of what's out there. So let me ask each of you, from a research standpoint, using that academic standard for polling and for research, are the polls that the media puts out there reliable? Ernest is shaking his head for our radio audience out there. He's making the face and kind of nodding his head back and forth, left and right.
A lot of it depends on which poll you're looking at, when the poll was taken, who are they actually polling, what demographic they happen to be polling, what questions they're asking them. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to answer your question without looking at those parameters.
Each individual poll.
Exactly.
But I think we can say that there is sort of a crisis going on in terms of public opinion polling. And we don't want to confuse some of the polls that come out now with the very high-quality research that, say, the Pew Research Center does, for instance. So when they do their polls, they are very careful to make sure that they have a representative sample. But there have been 3 trends that are affecting these, and one is the fact that most people these days use their cell phones primarily, and pollsters are prohibited from making auto dial calls to those cell phones. And so you think about what's the demographic of people who still have landlines.
It's going to skew older.
It skews older. It tends to skew less high income, lower income.
Tends to skew white.
Yes, it tends to skew white. So it's not a representative sample. You have fatigue with polling, so that you now have response rates of, I think, 8%. That's atrocious. You're basically, that's the equivalent of calling 8 people and assuming that opinion is similar to the opinion of 100 people, to be very simplistic about it. So that's the other problem. And another problem is people lie about whether they're likely voters. And so if you're going to be these polls are of likely voters.
Because you also don't necessarily want to be perceived as somebody calls and says, "Are you going to vote?"
Yeah,
you don't want to be the one to be like, "Nope, I'm sitting home on election day."
Right, right. And so that also distorts these polls. I think what's happened in the media industry to cut down newsroom staffs and has led us to grab for quick and easy stories, and there is nothing quicker or easier than a poll.
Yeah, I think if you go back and you look at it, a lot of the polling that you see sort of reflects this sort of let's just do a really quick poll, let's put it up on our website. It provides clickbait because people will see that. Well, Donald Trump is up by 11 points in Iowa. Bernie Sanders has closed the gap to within 4 on Hillary Clinton. That kind of thing. Somebody say, "Oh, wow," and they click on it, and boom, there you go.
Yeah.
Then and now you get the metrics that you're looking for in terms of how many people are actually coming to your site.
But the problem is it's having a role in who's on those stages for the debates, for instance. They're using polls to determine who gets on the stage and who doesn't. And consequently, if they were relying on inaccurate data, there may be voices that we're not hearing based on
and candidates who don't feel like they aren't getting a fair
problematic sorts of data. So I think it's a huge issue, and I think just like the difficulties in the media economic transition, that polling is similarly in a transitional state, and it's going to be a while till we figure out some of these problems.
Well, so it wasn't all that long ago that we were asking ourselves, will he or won't he run for president, and at that time it was Joe Biden. Now it's Michael Bloomberg. The former New York City mayor is said to be considering a third-party run for the White House, and if it happens, it's going to put his worldwide media empire in a bit of a tight spot. When he became mayor in 2001, he left the company, returned to the company in 2014 when he stopped being mayor of New York, and he's kind of always had this policy: you don't cover my wealth, you don't cover my business. Bloomberg doesn't cover Bloomberg. But if he runs for president, that's going to have to kind of throw that whole thing on its head.
Yeah, when I first saw this story, I think it came out on Saturday, if I remember correctly.
But lately, it seems like the most interesting stuff's happening on Saturdays.
Right, it just popped up on Saturday. And the
Last
first thing I think
couple
about,
weeks.
hey, if you're a billionaire, you too could be president. So, and it does create a problem because unlike Trump, who really wants the spotlight and wants to be covered and always has been, Bloomberg is sort of like, well, I want the spotlight to be on my company. And the spotlight can be on me if I'm in office, but not generally from my own company. So that's going to be very difficult when you're talking about running for president of the United States, and the fact that it is a national campaign and it stretches across economics, which is the main focus of Bloomberg, but it's not just that. I mean, it's economics, it's public policy, it's cultural, it's social. So it's going to be very difficult for his operation not to be able to cover that.
But there are a lot of other media outlets out there.
There are. It was actually really evident this weekend in the stories and the coverage of this possible run. There's these really long stories that you can take a look at on our links blog from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, from Politico. And then Bloomberg Politics has 2 sentences, 4 bullet points, and a link to the New York Times.
Yeah.
It just seemed like an interesting way to go about doing that. Well, now I want to go back maybe just a little bit more than a year ago when John David Weisinger called the San Diego office of the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's a civil rights group that advocates on behalf of U.S. Muslims, and he left a voicemail. In it, he said that the receivers of that voicemail would be in the news, in his words, like Charlie Hebdo. Then he sent an email to the group's spokesman threatening to show up any day with plenty of firepower and to kill any and everyone there. Last summer, he pled guilty to felony firearm charges and making a criminal threat determined to be a hate crime, along with another misdemeanor civil rights charge. Now that it's time for his sentencing, his lawyer blames this.
We have not taken action against the Muslim people, not at all. We have been tolerant of all religions.
It isn't a, quote, religion as such. It is a political system masquerading as a religion.
The truth is the truth, and Robertson has it mostly right.
And the unbelievers have got to be converted, and if they won't convert peaceably, they need to be put to the sword.
This is a holy war. This is essentially the Constitution versus the Quran.
Muslim hate crimes, not as big an issue as the White House would make you to believe.
So what you saw there is a montage, a series of clips from Fox News broadcasts, one after another with a deeply anti-Muslim tone. And his attorney says he committed these acts after a week of binge-watching Fox News. Debra, you've dedicated your career to religion reporting and doing it the right way, I'd like to say, not like what we're seeing there on Fox. When I first read this, my first thought is, ooh, it's the 2016 twist on the Twinkie defense. Your thoughts?
I thought, first thing I thought was, oh, the devil made me do it. So, well, first of all, I think there are two different issues. We do have a problem covering Muslims in a fair and balanced way in this country. And Fox News did have a number of people who have been labeled as huge propagandists, even by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate crimes. We also saw that crimes against Muslims or people who are mistaken as Muslims increased threefold during that two-month period in November and December. And Huffington Post counted some 80 anti-Muslim events. So I think there is certainly something real there in terms of a relationship. Now, did that lead this individual to pick up a gun or threatened to pick up a gun? I think that's ridiculous. We can find all sorts of things to blame people on. But we do know from surveys that people who have negative attitudes toward Muslims name the media as the number one thing that influences those attitudes. Now, that's the individual saying that. It doesn't mean that that's a fact, but I think we do know that hearing these kinds of statements over and over and over again certainly can be absorbed and lead to people understanding that as part of their worldview.
Yeah, in going back and reading the story, the attorney said, that yes, my client is culpable for his actions, but you also need to understand that he's being heavily influenced by what he was seeing on the media. But my whole point to that is there's a thing called a remote.
I was going to say change channel, turn it off.
You
press
can
button.
turn it off, or you can turn it to another station, or you can watch something else. I mean, yes, that's what they're putting on Fox News, but you can find that same sort of Islamophobia in all sorts of other media.
Well,
so I wouldn't necessarily say
enough,
it was just Fox News.
And interestingly enough, where I got some of that montage from, it's actually a clip that's on YouTube from the left-wing group called Media Matters for America, and it's a montage that they had put together. And interspersed with all of those Fox News clips are a lot of clips from CNN as well. And that CNN, it kind of, at least as framed by this group, is just as culpable, is just as guilty of spreading these anti-Muslim messages.
Well, I think
and not clarifying
Yeah, I think part of the problem, we talk about this on the show all the time, is that you have people.
Are you about to say context?
Well, context is part of it.
Okay, that's one of our favorite words.
But also part of it is that people are they don't have enough understanding of literacy, of news literacy, and what is news and what is opinion. And a lot of what is on Fox News and a lot of what is on CNN is more people giving their opinion about a news event as opposed to actual news and information that pertains to what's going on with the event. So that, to me, is a huge part of the problem. So when you start saying, well, Fox News did this or CNN did that, what part of that are you talking about? Are you talking about the opinion part or the talking heads part, or are you talking about the news part?
But if they're being responsible as a network,
the network
they should have multiple opinions.
I agree.
And I think on top of having a news literacy problem, there's a huge religious literacy problem, and there's a huge misunderstanding about what are the real tenets of Islam. And every time I see Pat Robertson's face drug out as evidence of this or that, I mean, that's a really you're dredging up some of the bottom feeders of this sort of
I think the media has in many ways abdicated its responsibility to educate people about certain things, and that I really have a problem with.
Okay, before we go, a fun one. Well, at least it's fun to me. Advice columnist Amy Dickinson got a letter from a reader looking for help. The letter itself, don't have time to read you the whole thing, but let me try to sum it up for you. The person writing in meets somebody famous in a gym locker room. Over time, they strike up a friendship, and then things changed. The famous guy asked permission to date the letter writer's ex, then ended up canceling plans on him to go out with her instead, the ex, and then has the nerve to call him up and ask for help moving furniture. Pop culture enthusiasts, maybe this sounds familiar?
Look at this guy. Does he have to stretch in here? You know who that is? Oh, that's Keith Hernandez. Keith Hernandez? The baseball player? Yeah, that's him. Are you sure? Positive. Wow. Keith Hernandez. He's such a great player.
The letter writer pulled a fast one, spoofing Dickinson with the plot line from one of the most popular episodes of Seinfeld. Punked by pop culture, this one gave me quite the belly laugh when I saw it late the other night.
Well, I mean,
I'm getting that look from Ernest again, you guys.
It's one of those things where I think it's the columnist has felt the need to respond, and so in doing so, opened themselves up to.
Well, and ask Amy. Amy Dickinson has written on her own blog like she didn't catch it. At least she's being self-deprecating about the whole thing. It kind of leads me to wonder, though, and this isn't the first time she's been punked. Last summer, somebody sent her the whole plot line to the movie The Room, and she responded to that too.
Well,
and
maybe she's not a Seinfeld fan.
Maybe. Who's
Look,
a Seinfeld?
There are lots of ways to check out whether the letter came from a real human being or not. It's really not that difficult. But on the other hand, this stuff's entertainment.
It is, isn't it? And look at it, how many people are now online and here on this program talking about Ask Amy. Well, that music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical director. Pat Akers is our audio engineer, and C. Chen our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. We'll see you next week.